Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining the Holocaust Center for Humanities Lunch and Learn program. I'm Alana Cohn-Kennedy, the Holocaust Center's Director of Education. I want to thank our community partners for supporting this program today, the Black Heritage Society, the Ray Walpole Institute for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Crimes Against Humanity at Western Washington University, and Pacific Lutheran University. 14 years ago, on this day, July 28, 2006, a man forced his way into the Jewish Federation building in downtown Seattle, and in an extreme act of anti-Semitism, began shooting the employees. He shot 6 women, killing one of them, Pam Wechter, a beloved community leader. On this day, we remember Pam, the 5 women who had and continue to have a long battle towards recovery, and all of those in our community who were affected by this tragedy. On this day, we remember, we reflect, and we recommit ourselves to fighting against hate, fighting for just laws, and striving for equity. The early laws created by the Nazis were based on legal models practiced in other countries, including those in the United States. Hitler and Nazi lawmakers were particularly interested in the United States' laws limiting the rights of Native Americans and all but wiping out their culture, and the Jim Crow laws successfully making African Americans second-class citizens. With us today is Tom White, Coordinator of Educational Outreach for the Cohen Center for Holocaust Studies at Keene State College in New Hampshire, to talk about the influence of racist policies in the United States on Nazi Germany. He serves on the board of directors of the Association of Holocaust Organizations, has participated as observer and facilitator in the global Raphael Lemkin Seminar for Genocide Prevention at the Auschwitz Institute for Peace and Reconciliation, and in 2015 was named a Peace Ambassador by the Center for Peacebuilding from Bosnia Herzegovina. Tom was also just appointed to the New Hampshire Governor's Commission on Holocaust and Genocide Education. Tom, we are so happy to have you with us today to join us for this program. To our participants out there, we will take questions periodically throughout the program. Please type your questions into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Thank you so much, Tom, for being with us today.
My pleasure.
Tom, I want to start by getting right into it, basically, and asking you a little bit about the influence of the United States' laws on Hitler and Nazi Germany. But even before Hitler and the Nazis took power, Hitler wrote about his admiration for US policies against Native Americans. Can you tell us a little bit more about this?
Sure. First, a welcome to everybody who's taking their lunch hour to join us today. And I think your question boils down to sort of 2 categories. One is ideological, and the other is rather practical. So on an ideological sense, social Darwinists in America in the late 1890s were already saying that there's really only one solution for the Native American issue, and that would be for them to become extinct. And I think this began to resonate in places like Germany after the First World War, where resources were scarce and people were looking for ways to redistribute or battle over these scarce resources. Hitler's imagination was fueled by reading novels about the American West. And he, in fact, in a speech in 1928, he was talking to the crowd how he admired how the Americans had shot millions of American Indians and then had put the remnants, as he said, on reservations for observation. Tying ideological social Darwinism to his thought process, the idea of expanding an empire by testing the mettle of a white race against a native race, to enslave them, perhaps annihilate them, at least put them in reservations, all of these sort of came together for him in what they would develop as Lebensraum, this idea of expansion through violence and enslavement and annihilation. So I think that's on a sort of ideological bent, what was fueling his imagination. And I think is really a bulwark of Lebensraum. When he talks about Lebensraum, he's talking about it in terms of the Wild East. Well, that's a direct reference to the Wild West, those stories that he had read about. On the other level, I think it's also practical. Here was a major world power committing genocide. and it was permissible, in fact, celebrated. And I've often remember the centennial, 1876, was the year Custer was slaughtered. And yet he became a great hero of public mourning, for he was a white man overwhelmed by the threatening natives. And this began to fuel the American psyche about how to treat natives in a way that was permissible. So I think it's an issue of looking at ideology and permissibility.
So this would maybe set the stage for what was to come.
I would think so, especially in his imagination.
Mm-hmm. So in the 1920s, French troops were deployed to Germany after World War I, and a small percentage of these troops were Black. And over 100 biracial children were born from relationships between these troops and German women. And the biracial children in the 1920s became an early target for Nazi and German racism on the grounds that they, quote, polluted the German race. And forced sterilization was suggested for this problem, but there was no law at the time that would allow for this. Can you tell us a little bit more about these so-called Rhineland Bastards and their treatment in Germany?
It's another great question. And I think this one boils down to sort of precursors and process. The idea of how is it the Nazis learned their trade? And so they identify right away this very small group of what were German citizens. These were children of German women, with the exception of a handful of Black Germans. And so immediately upon coming to power, this had been put on the table for Nazi thinkers about how to deal with the Rhineland Bastard issue. But it also gives you a sense of how the Nazis are forming themselves as a political movement in the 1920s. So, for example, when a small remnant of French colonial troops that were Black occupied the Rhineland, you see here I think on your screen now, yes, we have a couple of illustrations to use. We have this 1917 U.S. Army recruitment poster about destroying this mad brute. Well, the mad brute, in this case being the German, depicted like an ape. And of course, the sexual overtones here of raping white women. Where does this kind of the mentality then come from when looking at the one on the right, which is sort of a proto-Nazi early kind of image of the French colonial soldier, who again, who's an ape and an enormous threat to you as an ape, closing in on the Rhine and the Ruhr, seen for Nazi thinkers as sort of the heartland of Aryan womanhood. And so you have, is this an accidental kind of feeding of ideas? What I think you have going on here is, in that there's such a small group of Blacks in Germany, they're tapping into existing prejudices and learning. And so now the mad brute that was them gets projected back upon now the Black colonial troops, who ironically, by the way, were some of the most, if not the most, well-disciplined and behaved troops in the French army, knowing full well the racial hatred thrown toward them. During the First World War, for example, in 1916, Hindenburg himself, in his own private diary, talks about how the French are destroying the chance for white races to find out who's superior by polluting this all by throwing Black troops into the mix. He saw this somehow as cheating. And so you have this sort of white racial social Darwinistic construct in the First World War that is both promoted by the Americans and also the Germans themselves. And so as this becomes a problem and the Germans try to figure out how to deal with it, well, right away, America becomes an easy way to kind of reflect and think about how did America isolate Blacks and make them seem like these terrible boogeymen. So here, to me, this horrific image of the Watch on the Rhine would, I think, remind people who are a little older, like myself, of Little Black Sambo, although in this case, ready to come and destroy womanhood. On the right-hand side, kind of striking as well, in the 1930s, 1931, a Harvard professor wrote a book called Up from the Apes, where he described all uncivilized, inhuman behavior. And he's talking about every minority as ape-like behavior. And in this quote-unquote scientific revelation, where he talked about these were intangible and non-measurable truths, ironic for a scientist, he was comparing blacks to apes. And it's only a couple years later then tapping into sort of that, I guess, that mentality or zeitgeist of the time comes King Kong. And you see here on the on this slide, King Kong depicted in very similar ways as was depicted in that U.S. Army recruitment poster. Here, I mean, did you ever wonder in watching King Kong why this big ape was obsessed with a little teeny white woman? Well, this feeds right into this narrative of the dangerous threat of the black ape or monkey. And in the King Kong case, he is what? He's liberated from the darkness of Africa. He's brought back to civilization where he's in chains. All these things should ring bells. But then he rips those chains off because he couldn't be controlled, and he goes for the white woman. And of course, at the end of the movie, he's lynched. The planes come in, shoot him off of the Empire State Building, and the white woman is saved. That kind of mentality here, the other image in the middle of the screen, comes from Julius Streicher's personal copy of his History of the First World War. Now, this is bizarre. This is a German publication, and in it, though, you have this black ape-like figure coming in to ravage the German maiden. And so what you're seeing here are people believing this and sort of holding on to this as a mission that must be dealt with. In 1935, there was a meeting held about dealing with the Rhineland Bastard question, and they had located through a national registry about 385 children of French colonial soldiers and German women. And the meeting was, what do we do about it? So there is a law on the books about voluntary sterilization, that if someone volunteered to be sterilized, they could. And so the meeting debated, could we have these children volunteer to be sterilized? And I said, that's probably not going to happen. So the other issues that came on the table, and this gets to process and the Nazis evolving their thinking, was let's just create a new law that says black children of these soldiers must be sterilized. And they said, no, that would create too much public debate. That would be very uncomfortable for us. The next suggestion was, why don't we just make up fake symptoms? That the child came in because he had a tonsil problem and we accidentally sterilized him. There was a fear, no, that German doctors wouldn't do that. And I think, by the way, that fear was maybe even misplaced, because doctors and professionals get on board pretty quickly once it becomes state policy. The other interesting option was, what about if we can't forcibly sterilize them, why not deport them? And the Foreign Office stepped in and said, no, no one wants to accept our blacks, because at the same time you have British newspapers talking about the scourge of the blacks being used by the French to punish the poor Germans. This is from British newspapers. You even have the Social Democratic Party and President Hebert talking about really this provocation of sending black troops into Germany. So right away, the Foreign Office said, we can't deport these blacks, and then ominously said, because when we get to the Jews, we want to make sure we can get that right. So all these things are dovetailing together for these early Nazi thinkers.
So actually, that's a great lead-in into one of the next questions that I want to ask you about, which is, how was German racism against Jews different from American racism against Native Americans and African Americans?
So I think there's a lot of things racists share in common. And I think that's a combination of fear, trauma. When we think about trauma, I think there's a lot that sort of post-Civil War South has, and what becomes known, of course, as the lost cause that we all are very aware of now. The formulation of being victimized by outside forces, that trauma of the Civil War, of the South being devastated, white people being slaughtered in the war, fighting for what? Really, I think, echoes in many ways post-World War I Germany, where you have a country again seeing itself as victims of an outside conspiracy, of occupation, of having lost a war. That kind of trauma creates a need for answers. And people who are traumatized themselves, the ability to go through a normal grieving process of loss, whereby over time the pain recedes and one learns to, if you would, live with it, becomes very difficult for traumatized people. The trauma is real. We all know this. And you mentioned a terrific trauma that your own center is still suffering from. That trauma is as real and alive today as it was that horrible day that it happened. So when you get to those kind of things, when you don't have a chance for trauma to be dealt with, to be worked on, especially on a collective level, it becomes very difficult to deal with issues like peace, reconciliation, or even talking about the other who you're targeting. So I think you have that kind of in common. I think also Mein Kampf, reflects Hitler's imaginings here, and he's quoting Ford. He has a picture of Henry Ford in his office, a great anti-Semite, of course. He quotes the 1916 book Passing of the Great Race that talks, an American book, again, from, Ivy League college, where they're talking about the middle-class Protestant white race being supplanted and replaced by all these other mongrel races. And so you have U.S. immigration policy that's tied directly to eugenics, whether it be the Asiatic Guard Zone in 1917 that kept out, of course, Asians, but it also kept out homosexuals and idiots. Those were eugenics concepts. And so really, end of the First World War into the 1920s, you have eugenicists working with racists to craft policies that will protect white populations. By 1924, U.S. immigration policy is only admitting Nordic types, our language. And this kind, in fact, Coolidge himself, President Coolidge, who signs the bill, says we must keep America for Americans, whatever that might mean. But that comes from a sort of collective, still unresolved trauma of slavery and the Civil War in our country. So I think you have that. I think the difference between what the Nazis do and what we're going through, even though both of these are constructed as sort of a defensive response to outside aggression and trauma, the Nazis go a step further. I think this is where it becomes really lethal, more lethal, if you would, than what was going on elsewhere. And that's conspiracy theory. That once Jews are seen as part of an international conspiracy, again, from the protocols of the Elders of Zion that was created and made up in Russia before the First World War, they then become this invisible, ominous threat. And in that, there is no conspiracy and no one can find one. One can craft conspiracies that would make sense to people who are traumatized and need to find a way to put the worlds back together again. So I think the ominous difference between the two would be this idea of conspiracies. No one is talking in the South about blacks unifying and with a collective secret organization trying to overthrow the United States. The other, I think, interesting difference was, especially when the Nazis begin to look at American practices, what is practical, what is not. And the big difference for Nazi thinkers was when they started to target Jews, there was a sense that Jews were privileged in Germany. They were assimilated, they were wealthy, they were intermarried. And when they looked at America, they realized that was not the case in America, where blacks especially, but also brown and also, of course, Jews, were basically kept isolated. And so they were observing similarities, but also noting some differences.
Thank you. That's really interesting. You mentioned the conspiracy theories, which I think, of course, conspiracy theories about Jewish power, and of course we know those predate the Nazis and still exist today, something we're still grappling with. So we have a question.
Which is why, I hate to interrupt, but I think that's one of the biggest things today that concerns us as we hear conspiracy theories being spun for people who want to really maintain power all over the world. This is more than just, fun making up. This is lethal. And once you get to conspiracy theory, it becomes a live or die scenario.
There's a question that came in from one of our participants, Ryan, and I'm just going to read it to you. It goes back to some of the images you showed on propaganda. And Ryan writes, in seeing the King Kong promotional poster, I am reminded of the Nazis' extensive use of propaganda, film, and cinema. Could Tom please speak more to this topic and possible connections to express narratives of racism? That could be a talk all on its own, of course.
That's a great question. It is. And I spent some time looking at this. I mean, it's when you look at America film, for example, You have in The Littlest Rebel, Shirley Temple, who, I mean, come on, Shirley Temple. But right away, the film is all about all this sort of Southern myth about the lost cause, if you know this film. Becomes normalized. I mean, Gone with the Wind, which of course was taken down until historical analysis could be done of it, is the classic myth of the lost cause, that the Southerners, you know, not via forced labor or reinventing slavery after the Civil War, somehow raised themselves up all by themselves, which of course is a terrible myth despite all the other myths in Gone with the Wind itself. And so when you see film, and the Nazis were obsessed with film, they're obsessed with Hollywood. It became a very potent tool for the Nazis, especially more in anti-Semitism than anti-Black, because there simply weren't that many Blacks to worry about. But it became a massive tool for Herzegovina, for example, where they talk about Jews as rats coming out of the sewers, the idea of plague. When you get to the idea of plague, you're talking now about stuff that you never really see in American racial constructs. You see it in European constructs, especially tracing it back, but there's no sort of predictive history here, but tracing it back to the Black Death, where Jews are blamed for somehow poisoning the wells. So this idea of conspiracy theories is what the Nazis will pick up on, and of course really infuse into the films to make it, I think, normalized. I think we forget that for Germans, the issue for them after the First World War was a sense of disunity, discord, fighting on the streets, and constant turmoil. And they were seeking unity. And Hitler was offering them the sort of mythical, as were, by the way, the lost cause theorists in the Civil War, this mythical old days where everybody was happy, people knew their places. And they kept offering up this vision of sort of 1914 as being this unifying, and of course that's a myth as well, of Germany. So there's a lot of people who quickly buy into it, seeing unity as the end goal, and film just made it more mainstream and more normalized.
Thank you. So Tom, in an essay that I read that you wrote, you said that not only were the Nazis influenced by the Jim Crow laws in the United States, they actually found these too radical. Can you talk a little bit more about this, and what did they see in the United States that they figured wouldn't be accepted in Germany?
It's a great question, because the term isn't mine. It's actually a Nazi who's talking in a meeting. He says, this is way too radical for us. He wasn't talking about the racism. I mean, they envisioned hopefully someday to get there. This is an evolving process for them. In fact, in June of 1934, Roland Freisler, who many will know later as the great hanging judge of the Nazis' People Court, convenes a meeting to craft what will later become the Nuremberg Laws, really with the question, what are the Americans doing? And so you're looking at, I think, not issues of, boy, the Americans are just too racist for us. They're looking at, I think, practical implementation. So as I mentioned before, they recognize that Blacks, Jews, Brown, Native Americans have already been isolated, are already forbidden to intermarry, are poor, and on and on. But for the Nazis, they realized that's not the problem for them, because for them, they believed Jews had secret power, international conspiracy, were well placed and assimilated. And so that was what they're talking about. To get to that radical level of making Jews second-class citizens was going to take some work. It just wasn't practicable. I think adding that to sort of U.S. civil law course cases where you're talking about individual harm done to another individual, these are often tried in American courts by elected judges or carried out by elected sheriffs. Well, that would never happen in Germany. And so there's a lot of room to interpret the law in America, whereas in Germany, absolutely not. These were people working with strict and well-disciplined jurisprudence. And so what they start to see is these ideas are interesting, but can they be implemented in Germany? So I think what the Nazis come to are a couple of things. They actually sent a study tour to the South. It's interesting they come to America to find out how to be good Nazis, right? And when they go there, they recognize the difficulties, but then they gravitate quickly to the Human Betterment Society of California. And they look at American eugenics policy that's influencing immigration policy. And they start to discover that American immigration policy has divided people. In fact, Hitler mentions this in Mein Kampf, into sort of three categories. That Americans have nationals who are citizens. They have citizens themselves, and then they have what Hitler calls non-citizen nationals. What he's talking about is we have citizens, and the nationals are things like, well, Black, Native American. They're Americans, but they don't have all the rights everybody else has. And then, of course, non-citizen nationals are, by US Constitution, any territories that we take over, they must become citizens. Well, of course, that became very problematic for American racists at the turn of the century as we're getting Puerto Rico and all these other brown places. We didn't want them to become citizens. And so they become non-citizen. Puerto Rico should be a state. But of course it isn't, because that would somehow bring too many brown people into the country. So you're looking at those difficulties. And I think what the Nazis discover is, and you'll see this in the Nuremberg Laws and in the early legislation they passed, that immigration makes a lot more sense. What really made sense, and I think the clear cementing sort of between US and Nazi criminal law policy would be anti-miscegenation laws in the US. We are the only country in the world, I believe at the time, Australia might be another, I'm just not sure, maybe South Africa, but America was the leader that it was part of the criminal code. You could not have intermarriage. And in fact, in 1922, if an American woman married a non-citizen Asian, they would lose their citizenship. And the Nazis actually bring this to the table. Even though that particular law was canceled in 1930, the Nazis seem to have not noticed that. But they're bringing these things in that now make sense on the criminal law level, a violation of state and states' rights and states' agendas that were all based in eugenics, which then led them to think about sterilization, which is what California was doing. And so you have sterilization that's legal in 24 states. So now you're talking in the criminal law code, which would then tap very much into German lawyers and jurists who are looking at that kind of law. And I think the last part of this is that they noticed how laws can be made without ever defining race. Because the Nazis, of course, couldn't figure out how to define what a Jew was. And so they said, let's not be held up by that. There are ways to get around that. Look what the Americans are doing.
So we talked about some of these laws in a previous presentation we had on eugenics and people with disabilities. So thank you for referencing some of the sterilization laws that were in place in the United States as well, even at that time.
And I think you raise an important point, by the way. Sorry to interrupt, but that is a pretty common throughout Europe post-World War I, handicapped sterilization, and that you're going to find that all over Europe. And of course, in the US as well. The first sterilizations in the world were done in Indiana in 1907, and it was of handicapped people. So this is something that really gets momentum after the First World War, again, with perceived scarce resources, which then quickly gravitates to something quite different.
One of the shocking things that we saw that we were talking about previously in a previous week was that Washington State was one of the second states in the United States to legalize forced sterilization. So with the laws in 1935, so moving ahead a little bit, the Nazis looked at what was going on in the United States, and they passed the Reich Citizenship Law and the Law on the Protection of German Blood and German Honor. These were part of the Nuremberg Laws, which essentially made Jews second-class citizens in Germany. And these two laws were based on laws in the United States. And you referenced them, but can you talk a little bit more about how these laws were based on the US laws?
Sure. So the Nuremberg Laws themselves are sort of put together at the last moment. Hitler's going to the rally. He's promised a big speech about foreign policy. He's going to be talking about that Jews can't fly the Nazi flag. And he realized that he needs something better. Now, the laws have been, and they've been studying this now for a couple of years. And so now it gets ratcheted up very quick. In a day or so, they come up with the Nuremberg Laws. A couple of things to think about: what they accept and what they reject and what they create. So I guess three things. What they reject is the American construct of sort of the one drop of blood. So you have just after this, I think 1938, Senator Bilbo in America is talking about one drop of black blood will pollute the entire white race. And he's actually talking about, he's opposing an anti-lynching bill that had been on the floor that again, is still remaining on the floor of Congress all these years later. At the Nuremberg trial, laws, they don't accept. They think that's too radical. The one drop idea, you could argue maybe when they first start doing legislation, this is what they were thinking in July 14th, 1933, when they have the law for the civil service, the professionalization of the civil service. They're talking about getting rid of non-Aryans who have one Jewish grandparent, almost a one drop of blood kind of concept. But at Nuremberg, they reject that. And now they say 3 grandparents. So if you're a Jew and 25% of you actually have fled the country by now, you've gone to France where you've maybe been locked up by the right-leaning government that's trying to lock up Jews because they see them as leftist liberals, or Germans. You see back home that they've created a law, and these other countries didn't have clearly stated laws. And in many cases, Nuremberg seemed, I'm not going to say attractive, that's not the right word, seemed at least solidifying that at least we now know what the parameters are. And indeed, these laws seem to be a little bit better than what had happened in 1933. And so many German Jews who had fled actually come home to Germany with the Nuremberg Laws. I think the other part that I think is a direct connection is, of course, in the Reich citizenship law, you're forbidding intermarriage and sex as well. That comes directly from U.S. law, the anti-miscegenation laws in the U.S. So you are adopting that, and again, because of the criminal code level violation against the state, made a lot of sense to the Nazis. What is totally and entirely different, and this is when we get to sort of contrasting the two experiences here, is that the Nazis go in a direction we never imagined, making blood the test of citizenship. This is now going in an entirely radical direction. You know, so you have these sort of precedents, you have these other things going on. I think you have also for Germans, they see American racial policy as justifying their own behaviors. And in many cases, Hitler is saying things like, America has come a long way, we can do better. So whatever America did, they're going to ratchet up in scale, obviously. You have them even using American models to justify the Nuremberg Laws. Jack Johnson, who was a boxer, who had really upset white supremacist Americans in a boxing match against the Great White Hope, was villainized in America because he had married a white woman in Paris. And he was wealthy, so he was sort of the perfect boogeyman for a white supremacist in America. And so he was not allowed back into the country. Well, the Nazis in their propaganda talk about this. They say that Jack Johnson, this great boxer, is not even allowed to return back to America. And the reason why, mixed marriage, he's a polluter of the race, and that's a violation of the state. So the US has sort of connections here, but the Nazis are also taking it in an entirely new direction. And of course, these laws are not at all firm. They're going to be moving pretty quick.
So do you think white Americans recognize the similarity of the Nuremberg laws to the ones in the US? And did they respond to this?
Well, I think a couple of things. One, you know, Jews in the Nuremberg laws, they don't lose their citizenship. And I think this is the key thing most people don't realize. You know, had they lost their citizenship, they would never have been able to have passports, which was German policy, make Jews leave. So what are Jews in the Nuremberg laws? They are what? They are non-citizen nationals. Does that sound familiar? That's from US immigration law. And so for white Americans, this was tapping into their own aspirations. And indeed, right away, American eugenicists are praising Hitler. What are some of the words they use? They say that he's acting brilliantly, he's doing stuff we can't do. And so you have all this praise for him by American eugenicists, who, by the way, as we know, before the war, had been sharing conferences with Germans. You have American philanthropy of German eugenics institutions. They're not being created because of us. We have our two separate eugenics programs, but they're coming together here. You have this sense, too, of, well, not only are the Germans going further than we are able to go, you have this almost sense of they're going to solve crime that we can't solve. They're going to solve the racial problems. They'll become an example for us. I think this goes on and becomes uncomfortable for Americans. This is the era when Gone with the Wind comes out, which says, oh, we're racist, but it's really for a good cause. We even heard that this week from a congressman saying we shouldn't be teaching about slavery because, after all, slavery was really beneficial for all of us. So you have that level of racism. It becomes uncomfortable, though, as the Nazis progress. Immediately, American newspapers, some of them, of course, tend to be much more liberal, were saying, we're seeing what Hitler's doing with Jews. Will these kind of eugenics laws expand rapidly and target Jews? So they're already seeing that. You have this sort of debate going on in America that, of course, will fuel what goes on about the Olympic Games. You have the Nuremberg Laws are really all, they're based on placating radicals in the party, especially the SA, who are back on the streets beating people up, pushing the regime to be more radical. But it's also trying to get everybody set for the Olympic Games, which is very huge. And America debated going or not. And a lot of the debate centered on the Nuremberg Laws. So you have this sense of, do we go there or don't we? And of course, we go to the Olympic Games because the one running the athletic association is a Nazi-loving white supremacist. So in the end, I think what you're seeing here is a lot of acceptance and some trepidation, but at least hope by white supremacists all over.
And when these laws were passed in Germany, the Nuremberg Laws, what was the response from the German citizens?
Yeah, and I think you have the sense by 35 of the government doing something. They're now limiting the outrages of the SA, and there's general acceptance. In fact, even by Jews who return, that we now know the limitations of what's going on here. The protests that come a little bit later, 1937 and onward, handfuls of leaders, especially in the Catholic Church, will stand up against eugenics, but they are absolutely rare. And so mainstream Germans are accepting all of this as a cost of unity, of finding a better future. Yeah.
So I want to take a question or two that we received from our participants. One of them comes from Bob, who writes, where can I find resources on both the Rhineland Bastards as well as the Nazi study trip to the South that you referenced?
So what's going to work for me is, what I'll do is, rather than respond, because I'll only remember some and not others, I'll send them to you, I'll write them down, send them to you in a bibliography.
Right.
The sources are rather rare. I think this is something that's now being looked at more and more, but I'll try to get some sources out to folks.
That'd be great. And we'll post them on our website and we'll send them out in an email to all the participants. That would be great. Thank you.
Good.
There's another one here, and this is skipping ahead a little bit to the present, but Gail writes, what policies currently in place in America do you find most dangerous as far as allowing similar legal racism to gain momentum?
So the question comes from a place of deep concern. I think there are things that are alarming to us here and abroad. We're in a particular time where sort of democracy itself and its traditions are under attack all over the world. And that's true here. I think what, for me, it would be sort of the race-based immigration policies. They're tapping into the exact same formulas and arguments from the 1920s. Banning Asians always works. Again, identifying them as a threat is a commonality of racism, that we're defending ourselves against some kind of mysterious threat. The visa of my own boss being suspended because these were, well, it's a separate category. So these kind of, I think for me, it's mostly immigration law, refugee status. Canada just ruled in a court case that America is no longer safe as a haven for refugees and asylum seekers. That troubles me greatly because for me, that, of course, is our ideal.
So another question here, this one comes from Keel, who first of all says, thank you, Tom.
Hi, Teal.
And he says, would you be willing to talk a little bit about the ways that European anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism have survived into today, and how they are intersecting in our present-day American political and social discourse?
It's a great question. And I think my first reaction to that was anti-Semitism, really up until the Second World War, was a state-sponsored mechanism. Authorized early on, of course, in the early stages by the Catholic Church, with nationalism by states, but we're not seeing that anymore. We're seeing throughout Europe, Germany, for example, France, England, as states coming out against anti-Semitism, and often citing Holocaust memory as a reason why. So what you're seeing here are individual players and actors who are now fueled by modern technology. So, for example, at Charlottesville, where we had the Unite the Right rally, and you had one of the organizers had displayed the flag of the Romanian Iron Guard just before that. Why? Well, the alt-right in America, its gurus and thinkers are in Hungary and in Romania. And so you have this sort of this individual empowerment, especially through technology, that can unite white supremacists throughout the world. So that's my initial response. I'm sure there's more. I think Keel can push this a little bit more if he wants to, but that's my initial thought. I think there's hope in that there really isn't sort of the sponsor, the sanctifier of anti-Semitism. You have, I think, the contagion theory, this idea of rats spreading a plague, sort of the Nazi Herzegovina. That's certainly, it's certainly there. And what's interesting is those anti-Semitic images of Jews being plague bearers from the 14th century on are now being transferred to Asians. So you're having really this not being any more contained between a right or a left ideology or state-sponsored ideology. They're very fluid. And so these old terms, whether we're used to states, right, left, anti-Semitism, aren't as significant anymore as individual or small group players.
Thanks, Tom. So I want to back up again a little bit, and you referenced earlier the eugenics movement. The United States was a leader in the eugenics movement, which was the study or belief in the possibility of improving the qualities of the human population, especially by such means as discouraging reproduction by persons having genetic defects or presumed to have inheritable, undesirable traits. German scientists were not only influenced by American eugenics, but they were also funded by Americans. So how were the two countries feeding off of each other to promote these ideas and supporting each other?
And before I answer that, I'd be wrong. I just realized I left out other dynamic on your previous question, which is places like Hungary would be leaning more toward the previous model that we discussed about state-sponsored anti-Semitism. Not officially, and of course their tool in places like Poland would be about Holocaust distortion, not necessarily denial. So the other models are still there, just the other ones are more prevalent. But getting back to American and German intercooperation. So, it's interesting that that study group came to the US and it came from the Prussian Ministry of Interior. So this is actually just before the Nazis, the Prussian under Goering are looking at this kind of stuff, because those connections are already there. And so you have big philanthropists fueling things like the Kaiser Reich Institute and others, and they're dealing with very similar issues, but both programs have developed on their own. And so like any expert, you're looking at other expertise and you're having conferences and you're sharing papers. And so this sort of cross fertilization of ideas is really, I think, the way to look at this. But I said by December 38, 39, American eugenicists are becoming very uncomfortable what they're seeing in Germany, I think because it reflected a bit too closely what was happening here. And I mentioned, again, this is why Gone with the Wind becomes so important, because it placates white supremacists, and eugenicists and others who have been playing this race card. And they get to argue, well, we're not bad racists. We're not like those Nazis. So they made the break, and by 1938-39, American eugenicists and the Anthropologist Association is talking about biological racism not being real science. But of course, cultural racism, this idea that, well, blacks, really are more violent, more crime prone, they don't fit the white Protestant ideal, cultural racism still remains common between both groups. What the separation became was about biological racism.
In the same essay that I referenced earlier that you wrote, you said American racists always justified their hate by claiming victimhood status and blaming the evil that they embrace on the target of their wrath. This is an excellent description of the appeal of Nazism. Can you explain this statement, and does today's racism still reflect this? And if so, can you give us an example?
Let me go, let's put up that slide that we've got on comparing and contrasting. I think we have. So there are things here that are again, quite common, where you have, I think, unresolved trauma, this sense of this inability to heal out of trauma, the separate narrative or ideology, whether it be Nazi, whether it be the lost cause, that gives them sort of a new reality, the trauma carried over, the inability to see others suffering. Can we compare what happens in the US with what happened in Europe with the Holocaust? Is this apples and oranges? Is the Holocaust sacrosanct as an unprecedented horror? So I think what I like to do is just briefly look at these two slides. And argue that if one is only comparing one to the other, it's a very bad proposition. First, it kind of makes all perpetrator blame the same. It gets rid of uniqueness and specificity. However, I think when one compares, you must also contrast. And we always forget that part of the equation, maybe we do. But I think when you contrast the similarities and differences, and that's what we've been doing today a little bit, I think it allows us to do what we as teachers really desperately want to do, is raise questions. And I hope that's what we're doing today. So I'm going to try to raise some questions here. I put these two slides together and I decided which ones to use. The one I was also thinking about is General Eisenhower and Patton and Bradley at Ohrdruf, a subcamp in Neuengamme, where he's looking at these railway ties of Jews being burnt and incinerated here just before liberation. And immediately I thought of the same railway ties where Black Americans had been burnt after having been lynched. Now, the crime takes place in a different time, a different place, different circumstances. But I think there's something very similar about methodology, about the evil, about the perpetrator. So we're going to contrast them here a little bit. On the left, you have, and I'm very cautious about imagery, by the way, this is an image taken by someone, of course, attacking the Warsaw Ghetto in 1943. He has framed the image he would like you, or specifically those back in Berlin reading the report, to see, which is how a handful of Germans, of course, could round up all these Jews. So there's no context other than him saying we rounded them up today. But of course, this takes place after months of fighting in the Warsaw Ghetto. These are the children and the sisters and grandparents who've been hidden in the underground bunkers, and after months of fighting are now being surrounded and taken out, having resisted as best they could all that time. Here you have the photographer taking his friends, picture of his friends, who are looking at the cameraman, very proud to be seen what they're doing, in fact, demonstrating their manhood. What's interesting for me is, of course, these guys were all, a lot of them were put on trial in the 1950s and 60s for war crimes. And in fact, the fellow you see here in the background, right below my guilty sign, was known as Frankenstein for what he had done in the ghetto. He's executed as a war criminal. So I see what might be similar, but maybe a contrast to what takes place here on the right, which is in Marion, Indiana, August 7, 1930. So again, 3 years before Hitler comes to power, you have a lynching. Now, I have cropped this image. I have taken the top away because in the image you would have seen two of the three black teenagers, Americans, who had been hung that day, having been accused of being sexual predators. And what's interesting about that picture for me is two things, really. It is widely circulated in the US. You can buy these in drugstores or whatever, because it took place outside of the Deep South. This was Indiana. Now, most lynchings are taking place in the Deep South, but when you have one outside the Deep South, white supremacists in the South, that minority, could say, see, this is happening everywhere. What to me is similar is that everyone in the photograph wants to be seen in the photograph. Here they are committing murder in both pictures, but neither of them feel guilt at all. In fact, want to be seen as having done this because in their mind, it's justifiable. It is self-defense. It is asserting their superiority, I suppose. So you have, I think, this interesting contrast. Can one say, therefore, that lynching is like the Holocaust? Well, right away, scale comes to mind. But then again, looking at how many blacks were enslaved in America versus how many Jews there were in Germany in 1933, you see a different kind of scope and scale. So in the end, I think for me, what helps guide these questions and contrasts is, again, General Eisenhower, who when he saw Ohrdruf and he saw these rail ties, and I think a lot of our soldiers liberating the camps come to the same conclusion. They are recognizing that evil is very specific, that it is targeting groups that we think are not like us. And it might assuage trauma, but clearly it's perpetration. And he looked in horror, and in fact, I think Patton himself threw up that day, but he said, we are told the American soldier does not know what he is fighting for. Now at least he will know what he is fighting against. And I think the images of the camps resonate. And I think this really fuels the civil rights movement that FDR had tried to begin. And it's the fight that we continue today. And I think the way we start with this is when you look at these two images, for me, and this comes from a conversation I had this morning with our director, Peter McBride from Northern Ireland, who had gone through the traumas of the Trouble. And he said he was in Rwanda and he was looking at one of these churches and the corpses were still there. It was just after the genocide of Rwanda. And he said everybody there with him was sort of empathizing with the victim, traumatized by that. And he said for him, he was thinking of the perpetrator. And when I look at images like this, I think of the perpetrator because the perpetrator could be us. We have our own influences, societal, family, who fits and who does not. And as you know, these are people who willingly go along with Hitler and justify it and sleep very well at night and tuck their kids in a bed at Auschwitz. So I think for me, these kind of questions not only are historical about comparing and contrasting, but become very personal. Which side of the equation do I begin asking my questions about? For those who are traumatized, even white people here are traumatized, not at all to the same degree. But of course, they're holding on to this memory of what was lost from the Civil War, or what they perceived lost, because many Southerners wanted to stay in the Union and were against slavery. But in this case, that trauma is there. And I think the way that we move forward is through compassion. This idea of compassion, which is acknowledging shared suffering, not to equate them, these are different, but to look and say at this picture, what does the perpetrator tell me? What questions does it give of me?
So I think those are big questions for us all to take away with, which is in part, what is our responsibility, and also what are we each potentially capable of? So I guess one of the last questions maybe I'd like to ask you is, what is the big takeaway from this presentation and from this topic today that you would like people to come away with?
I think when you're seeing things that are uncomfortable to you, you have made yourself vulnerable, and that's a good thing. Because for me, when people say my identity is at stake here, I often like to say, if I'm compassionate, I want to find out what the other person is suffering, what they're going through, not to equate it or even try to understand it. So the starting point is seeing others first, not defending your position, to listening to that trauma first. I think that's our best way forward. And again, not to equate, but to start there. I think also this stuff is real. What we're seeing in our country and in the world today is, again, classic racism. And how does one define racism? Kendi talks about how to be an anti-racist. is to recognize that racism is not institutional. It's not, we're not born into it, but it's a choice of policy and policymakers that are seeking inequality. So when you're looking at inequity, you identify racism and ask yourself, what do I do? So in the end, I think the questions are, yes, of history, but more of ourselves. What questions are we asking of ourselves? What's at stake in what we're seeing? And of course, having the hope that education and recognizing this and having programs like this and being together as people, that we in fact can make a difference because we are on the right side of history.
Yeah, you added one other interesting thing in an earlier conversation, and you said one of the things that you hoped people would take away was that the Holocaust wasn't just possible, it was permissible. And I thought that was such an interesting way to phrase it, because it also means it's not inevitable, but we allowed it to happen. And I think that's the case with so much of this racism. Like, we can make choices and have options available.
One survivor put it, the road to Auschwitz was paved with righteousness. And so rather than see perpetrators as evil, psychotic people, these are people who are living in their own moral universe. And that moral universe says others don't fit in my moral universe. And I think to recognize that there are parallel moral universes in our world, that people actually do believe this stuff, is our starting point. And then how do we bridge those divides? And I think it's through compassion and truth and speaking the truth to what we're seeing. But you're right, this was all about not being forced upon anybody, but becoming permissible. And I think the other thing I like to think about is a lot of us don't commit these crimes, right? We're watching them, or we're not responding to them, we're feeling guilty about not responding. But I think the other thing is collaboration. And collaboration becomes easy if we're confused as human beings about this is way too much for us. It becomes much easier to collaborate. Once you collaborate, you're on board as sort of the zealot who's just been converted. I think we can never allow that. And we must always see the face of the other in anything that we do in our work.
Tom, thank you so much. I think you've given us a tremendous amount to think about. And I know we've had lots of questions in the chat that we didn't get to, and lots of questions about resources. So I look forward to getting your bibliography that I'll post on our website, and we'll email it out as well for people who want to learn more or follow up on some of these topics. And you've just been a wealth of information. Really appreciate you being here with us today.
And also, please have people contact me if they would like. My email, I'm sure you can provide for them. And I look forward to further conversations with my good friends in Seattle and all those who tuned in today.
Thank you. So this program, for everyone listening, was recorded, and you can find it on our website starting tomorrow, in case you know of anyone else who wants to catch up on what they might have missed today, or if you want to rewatch part of it. Thank you to everyone for joining in with us today. We couldn't offer programs like this one without all of you and our supporters. If you are able, please consider making a donation on the Holocaust Center's website, which is holocaustcenterseattle.org. Just click the donate link in the top right corner of the page. Thank you for your support. It makes these programs possible. And at the Holocaust Center for Humanity, it takes a dedicated team to continue offering a large variety of programs virtually, including book talks, programs for young adults, teacher workshops. Our next one is tomorrow in partnership with the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum on teaching about Nazi racism and anti-Semitism. And you can find out more on our website and still sign up. And I want to give a very special thank you to Richard Green, our Museum and Technology Director, who's running the technical side of this show behind the scenes. Also, thank you to our Executive Director, Dee Simon, and our entire team, Nicole Bella, Lori Burchell-Cohen, Julia Thompson, Paul Regelbrug, Rosa Campos, Sydney Dradel, Ellie Selesky, and Amanda Davis, and Katie Lawrence. Thank you again for joining us today, and I hope you will be able to join us next week on Tuesday at the same time for an incredible opportunity to hear from Holocaust survivor Peter Metzlar, who survived the war in hiding thanks to rescuers who risked their lives to hide his mother and himself. Thank you so much. This concludes our program for today, and we hope to see you next week.